Hello everybody. I have a few pieces of plywood that were discarded from another build, and I was wondering what I could make with this. These pieces of plywood were set aside because we noticed that the layers of plies were splitting apart. You can see on this one piece of plywood how there is a very large gap in the middle of the board. In order for me to work with this material, I will need to glue these layers together again. Also, I just want to add a big disclaimer here. I chose to use this wood because I have very little knowledge of woodworking, so I figured I would learn how to make a drawer using scrap pieces of wood I already have. First thing I need to do is to get these boards glued together again. I decided to use white glue as it's what I had available and I know it has great bonding strength. I simply squeeze the glue inside the seam and let it run down into the board. Next, I grab a 2x4 and clamps to hold the board together. And while the first piece of plywood cured, I continue gluing up all the other pieces of plywood that had this same issue. For the larger plywood board, I am using this cornered circular saw to cut the board into a smaller piece. I find it easier to cut them this way than to run them on my table saw. Once they are in more manageable pieces, I run them on the table saw to get the final length I need. I decided to build the main panels of the drawer using miter angles, and I just want to repeat again that I have no knowledge how a proper cabinet or drawer is made, so going with the miter angles was just me trying to figure out how to put this thing together. Once I had all the pieces of the drawer cut to size, I decided to make a dado or groove for the center piece of plywood that will divide the drawer. I found the center of the panel and marked it. I set up my router to the height I needed and I made some test runs on a scrap piece of wood. I didn't have my tripod with me for the majority of this build, but this is what it looks like after I ran the router through the panel. I began fitting the pieces together using a square clamp that I normally use for stuff like welding. Looking back now at this, I don't think I would build another cabinet like this. The miter corners do not create a strong joint, and because these miter corners were very unstable, I had to temporarily use a few screws to actually keep the pieces together. The wood I'm using is not suitable for a stained finish, so I will cover up these holes and paint them over in the end anyways. I also test fit the middle panel to see how my dado or groove turned out, and I was happy to see the inner panel fit perfectly inside. This is where I saw an opportunity to give this drawer much needed strength by adding a piece of wood across the back of the cabinet like this. I marked the notch I needed to make on the panel and used this jigsaw to cut it on both ends. I then reinserted the panel back on the drawer to see how everything fits. I inserted the smaller pieces of wood that would brace the back of the cabinet and I saw that it worked out nicely. Everything looked great, so I decided to glue it all together. This is another reason I don't think I will do miter corners again for this kind of build. White wood glue does not work very well when applied to the end grain like this, so I decided to use staples to help everything stay together. The smaller pieces were also glued together and stapled onto the frame. Yeah, I know it looks incredibly ugly and I butchered this drawer every way possible, but at this point I was determined to turn this cabinet into something usable. And every step I got closer to something resembling a piece of furniture. Now, if you were not convinced if I'm really using recycled pieces of wood, I flipped the drawer over to start working on the front of the cabinet and I had another panel coming apart, but I lathered it with glue, clamped it together and continued building. Next was the hardest part of this build. This is going to be a 3x3 drawer cabinet and I needed to divide the drawer into 3 parts, while taking into consideration the horizontal dividers that would later be added as well. This process was so daunting to me that I can't even properly explain how I did it, so if you're trying to maybe build something similar, just grab some rulers, clamps, and measure everything twice. After I had a rough idea how big my drawers needed to be, I cut all the pieces of wood I needed to assemble them. The main structure of the drawer cabinet is made of 3/4 plywood, but I had enough half-inch plywood to use for my drawers instead. Now for my individual drawers, I have all the pieces on the table. You can see now that I'm doing butt ends and no more miter cuts. Also, 3 of the panels will need a dado or groove for the bottom of the drawer to slide between them, and one of the panels will need to be cut shorter. The smallest router bit I had was too big for this, but if I ran the boards twice on the table saw, I could get a good sized dado for these boards. Here is one drawer glued and stapled together with the dado going around the panels. The bottom of the drawer cabinet slides in around the 3 panels and stopping flush with the shorter panel. The bottom of the drawer is then secured with 2 screws. This makes it easy to change out if it ever gets damaged. After I was done with my individual drawers, I started working on getting all those staples, screw holes, and other defects covered with some putty. I sanded it multiple times until it was smooth to the touch. I also added more support, like another piece of wood to hold the back cover of the cabinet. If you have not noticed, there is a crucial piece missing from my drawer cabinet. I do not have a base or legs for this cabinet to stand on. In a normal cabinet build, your legs are part of the structure of the cabinet, but up until now, I just been building a box frame with drawers. Going into this build, I had very little to no experience building a drawer, and even less knowledge how to actually attach some kind of base or legs to what I had already built. I looked for ideas and I tried different things and basically began building a base for the cabinet. I put all the pieces together using glue and more staples, but no more miter corners. It wasn't much, but I finally had a base for my cabinet. I just needed to add more support to it. I saw a picture of a drawer cabinet with horizontal dividers and I thought it looked great, so I decided to add them to the drawer as well. Again, it was very difficult to properly space them apart, but I just kept measuring until it was perfect. I was running out of scrap pieces of plywood and I still needed to make my drawer faces. So I looked around and grabbed whatever I could find, even if I had to use mismatching material. And now, the only thing I purchased for this drawer cabinet build, the drawer slides. I needed to install my drawer slides on the drawers and the cabinet so that I could mount the drawer faces. Putting on the drawer slides on the main cabinet was also a pain, and I used different size pieces of wood to get the height I needed them at. But after some tinkering, I was finally able to get my first drawer installed, and it was incredibly satisfying. I bought these drawer slides at Home Depot for about $6 each. I bought 6 of them, so this cabinet build was literally just the cost of the slides, $36. I saw this very simple trick to mounting the drawer faces, and it was to use a few pieces of double-sided tape like this. I also have a piece of plywood and 2 washers to help me get the spacing right. With the face mounted, I can remove the drawer and permanently attach the face. The way I did this was by drilling 4 pilot holes while the face was still mounted using double-sided tape. I also made a guide so that the screws will all be evenly spaced apart. Also, I got another surprise as one of my drawer faces was starting to split open, but I glued it and clamped it and kept on going. I was very happy with my drawer so far, but there was something missing. I did not want to buy new drawer handles, nor did I want to change the aesthetic appearance of the drawer cabinet with them. So I looked for ideas and I settled on having an opening for you to put your fingers through to pull the drawer open. It was nothing fancy, but just 2 45-degree cuts and enough space for your hand to fit through. I removed the bulk of the material with a hacksaw and the remaining pieces with a wood chisel. This is what the cabinet looked like after I finished with all the individual drawers. I was having a hard time deciding whether to leave it like this or to paint it. The drawer had a lot of visual imperfections, mismatching pieces of wood, but in a weird way it gave it a lot of character. In the end, I decided to go ahead and paint it so it can have a proper finished look. Now, keeping the idea of using as much recycled material as possible, I decided to dig out some old cans of paint. I wanted a two-tone color scheme, and my first choice was this espresso color that I purchased back in 2016. And no, this is not new paint in an old can. There are a few hardened pieces and debris inside, so I had to strain it before using it. I started with the base of the cabinet. I rolled on the first coat and waited for it to dry to apply a second one. Also, you can look at some of the additional bracing I added to this because it was very flimsy without it. And finally, the point of no return, applying the first coat to the top of the cabinet. Here is the first coat on the top. I really like how well this dark color was hiding a lot of the imperfections and all my staple and screw holes I butchered onto the cabinet. And this is the top and sides done. I like the way the dark color contrasts against the natural wood on the back of the cabinet. I didn't want to paint the inside of the cabinet, but you can see some of the natural color on the sides. So after much hesitation, I took off all the drawer slides from the main cabinet so that I could paint the inside as well. All I had left was the mismatching drawer faces, and I wasn't sure what to color them with. I found this can of paint that is actually the color of my interior walls of my house. I figured it looked similar enough to the back of the drawer cabinet, and I decided to give it a try. I rolled on the first coat and was extremely happy to see how natural the color looked. The moment I finished painting the first coat, I knew I was going to have an amazing looking drawer. Now if you thought I couldn't make any more mistakes in this build, you're wrong, because I'm about to glue the base of the cabinet to the drawer with construction adhesive and more wood screws. Here are a few pictures of the final results. I am honestly in disbelief that I could have made something like this, and even more amazed that I could have built it using the materials you saw in this video. I could have not imagined a better outcome from this build, and I am extremely proud because this drawer is actually not even for me, but for my wife, who has been using these very flimsy Walmart drawers, and I kept promising her a proper drawer, but was never able to get around to it until now. I hope you guys have enjoyed watching this video, that you can learn from the many mistakes I made, or that perhaps it has encouraged you to build something as well. If you made it this far, I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel and that you give it a thumbs up. Thank you for watching, and until next time.